I'd like to open up by welcoming each of you to our study on Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. Such a study of this work is an enormous pursuit, as every page is filled with mystery and sometimes almost impenetrable lessons on the human psyche. Because of this, I have to limit the lesson to some manageable time, so I cannot present this book in its entirety, but I believe that I can give you kind of the basic idea and the basic tools of what Kierkegaard is saying so that you will be able to continue your study through this book on your own. I'll be following a book called Kierkegaard Anthology by Robert Brettel. This is what it looks like as a guide, and I do highly recommend it. And I recommend it to you as a place to begin such a study. Not only a study on sickness unto death, but it contains many other of Kierkegaard's works. I'll include some quotations on the screen where I find it necessary, but mostly I'll give you my explanation of the verses as to what Kierkegaard means. I've selected certain readings from which I will comment, so it might be difficult to follow even if you have the book. I won't really be jumping around. It will be linear. However, I will skip certain areas because they're redundant or beyond really the scope of our work here. Now, Kierkegaard is known. You can't really say the name Kierkegaard without reflecting on him as the father of existentialism. I'm not sure that he really would have approved of such a title, but I think I ought to present, or at least start this lecture by giving some kind of definition of what an existentialist is, at least in my terms. Such a term is very subjective as to include atheists such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, as well as its founder who sees it in terms of Christianity. I think that Kierkegaard would express an existentialist not as someone who studies it out of books, including his own works, but one who chooses to exist. He chooses not only to exist, but to accept who he is and make decisions to become this very person. This means a purposeful existence, which is based upon whatever a man holds as the utmost authority. I also believe that Kierkegaard taught that the only thing that can bring man out of despair is appearing before God in a state of truth. And we'll get into that a little deeper, exactly what that means. But that, I think, is the end game for Kierkegaard and the solution. Although many have replaced God, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Friedrich Nietzsche, with some other authority or power, such a replacement will always fall short of being the ultimate power, God. I'm not sure that every one of you will agree with me. Some may disagree with this opinion, but I hope that this won't prevent you from listening to the rest of this lecture. Now, Kierkegaard begins with a strange introduction into the idea of spirit and self. And I'll first read it and then make some comments concerning it. Don't be put off by this. Don't be thinking that you'll never understand this and this is going to be way over everybody's head, because for the most part this is over everybody's head. We have to really take this slowly and carefully to understand this. But don't judge the book by this one paragraph. Kierkegaard says this: man is spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self. What is the self? The self is a relation which relates itself to its own self. Or it is that in the relation which accounts for it that the relation relates itself to its own self. The self is not the relation, but consists in the fact that the relation relates itself to its own self. Man is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, it is a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two factors. So regarded, man is not yet a self. So you can tell, if you picked up one of Kierkegaard's books and that was the first paragraph you read, you'd probably put it down pretty quick. But don't worry, don't get too far ahead. I want to start it off with that because that really is important to hear what he's saying about the self. The idea behind Kierkegaard's statement or introduction about defining what it means to be a self is extremely opaque, or rather cryptic. Some have wondered whether he was serious about this or if it was some form of ironic spoof on Hegel. The end result of this definition is that it is not really a definition after all, but rather a summary of the subject matter of which he is about to embark upon. It's kind of like a thesis statement that he's making. He's saying, these are the things I believe to be true. Now I'm going to show you how and why they're true. So it's important, of course, always to read the thesis statement of any kind of essay or journal, and so that's why I thought it would be necessary to read this. His conclusion is that man is not a self, after all, based upon this definition, and that he will now explain why this is so. So if you remembered what he was saying, is his conclusion is that based upon all this information, man really isn't a self. But we must still take a closer look at the introduction in order to get a sample or at least a taste of exactly what this sickness unto death is. First, he seems to steer us away from thinking that the self is some kind of separate and distinct abstraction, but is rather best understood in the concept of relationship. This is something that has been overlooked today. I think that in theology especially, we must look at man and God and man as they relate to one another. And I think this was really the preaching of Christ. And if we listen with this state of mind that we're listening for relationships and to improve relationships, I think our theology will be much better and much more practical than just some isolated doctrines. It's not, however, a relationship to the self, and that would make man totally independent of God as well as others. So when Kierkegaard talks and he says it's not a relationship of the self, what he's saying is that if a self is related to itself and that was all there was to it, we would be independent of God. We wouldn't take the divine factor into play. And so we must do that. So the self is understood as a process of relationship, not to the self, but to something outside the self. And as we'll see the end result of this as we continue on down. That the argument is that man must be in a relationship with God such that he must stand before him in truth. And I'm going to echo this theme as we continue on through, because this is really at the heart of Kierkegaard's thinking, his ideology, his theology, and certainly this work, Sickness Unto Death. But there's another issue that lies beneath being a self, that is man's awareness of being a self. So it's not enough to be a self, but man must be aware that he's a self. Or perhaps he's not aware he's a self. And this is, again, what we'll go into. If we go back to the story of Adam, we see that there is no evidence that prior to his sin that Adam had any knowledge of being a self, but was content in his pure relationship with God. The self was very transparent to Adam until after his sin. And it was at that time that he became aware of his nakedness. Now, the story of Adam and Eve, whatever you believe it to be, whether you believe it to be fiction or fact or metaphor or a blending of all of those, is not really important. But in the story lies a lot of truth, and Kierkegaard comes back to that as well as I do, that if we look at Adam and we see he was happy, Adam and Eve were happy in the Garden of Eden, and there was no evidence that he had any consciousness of being a self. That didn't happen until after the sin, and that's when he realized he was a self. He was naked and needed forgiveness. So it's not our goal to become aware of the self, but rather to understand ourselves so that the self becomes transparent. This is a term that Kierkegaard will use later on as well. This can only take place when we stand before God in a state of purity, where the only self that exists is God's self. At least we might say the self that overwhelms our self, where our self is subsumed into the self of God. Today, we don't seek this transparency so much. We're not even aware of it. Rather, we try much harder to become a self, which makes us more aware of being independent of God. And this is one of the issues that's kind of an underlying idea in this work, is that the more we try to become a self, the more independent we become of God, and the further we get from God and from truth. So the answer is not in figuring out how to become a self, but it's how to stand before God. This transparency also has a sense of approaching God in complete truth without any deception. This idea of transparency we'll continually talk about. It has different ideas. One idea is something you can see through, meaning something that is kind of there, but it's not visible. That would, in one case, be ourself. And another way, being transparent is able to be seen, that God would see inside us and see everything of who we are, which would be the transparency that would enable such a perfect truth in a relationship. I find it peculiar that Kierkegaard would seriously try to define a self, since this seems to be counter to his general thesis. So we must look into this as a lesson, perhaps written through irony or some other literary vehicle, to frustrate those who try to define man in these terms. So there's also in this beginning, I think, a kind of irony, and which is what Kierkegaard is most famous for, to frustrate man who is going to say, I'm going to figure out who the self is, I'm going to resolve it, and understand the perfect psychology. Kierkegaard writes this in the beginning to kind of put your head in a spin, and he's usually quite successful, because again, it is quite opaque and very frustrating to try to figure out exactly what it is. And I'm not going to attempt to do that. I'm only attempting here to draw out some of the truth that's in this introduction. We do relate to ourselves because we exist in time, and we can perceive ourselves as to who we were in our childhood, up to what we did a minute ago. So we are aware of ourselves because we're temporal. And Kierkegaard kind of mentioned this. The idea that we exist in time means we can remember ourselves as to who we were in our childhood, in our young adulthood, and depending upon how old you are, you can remember yourself up to 1 minute ago. So we have a temporal existence, and we do relate to ourselves and are able to perceive ourselves through that temporal relationship. We also have a psychological awareness in that we can think of ourselves as one mind, one spirit, one body, etc. So we think of ourselves, we talk of ourselves, about ourselves. We define these abstractions of ourselves as well. We can relate to ourselves as to our desires, to our thoughts, to our failures, etc. There's so many different ways we relate to ourself. So we do have relationships with the self on at least these levels. But this self is not the relation that Kierkegaard is really talking about. We cannot see the self in some static component or as a static component, but better thought of as a dynamic process that may not be able to be seen from an internal aspect, but only from an external one. So one cannot truly see the self from internal to the process. It is difficult for any process to understand itself until the process is complete, because we're in the middle of the process and it is not yet complete. So it's kind of very difficult for us to see ourselves as a complete self, as a unit, when we're part of the process. The self is a synthesis of those qualities listed. All those qualities that I mentioned and that Kierkegaard mentioned, they all kind of come together to create the self. This is what we'll go into in greater detail as we continue. This idea of synthesis is very difficult to grasp, since the infinite and the finite cannot really come together in one sense. How do you synthesize the infinite and the finite? For the infinite to synthesize with the finite, it must become finite, or the finite must become infinite. This synthesis creates a paradoxical nature or a tension to the self, which we will also deal with as we go by, and which Kierkegaard deals with quite a bit in his other works as well. So if we don't understand it in this work, there are other works as well. Existing as a self, we are aware of this tension and the paradox, and as Kierkegaard puts it, this is not a state of unity, but a state of disunity. This means that he's not a self because it's impossible to unite the finite and the infinite. And the state Kierkegaard refers to is the state of sin, or the state of despair. So the state that man exists in is not a state of unity, but a state of despair. Now, I want to, at this time, read from our work of the Kierkegaard anthology. And I try to keep this to a minimum because I know how boring it is to listen to somebody read, but I think it's necessary for me to read a few of these paragraphs. So I have 3 such paragraphs to read, and then we'll continue. Man is not a unity, but a disunity. I'm sorry, this is also on page 340, if anybody would like to follow. Man is not a unity, but a disunity. He's not a true self, which means that he is not a self at all. The sickness unto death is an investigation of this corruption in human nature, which of course is what the Church calls sin, but which Kierkegaard, in accordance with the psychological viewpoint here adopted, chooses to call despair. On page 341, he continues, the author of the sickness, or the sickness unto death, definitely commits himself to it as the only cure for the mortal disease which infects every soul, whether the soul is aware of it or not. Every individual, whether by not willing to be himself, or by willing despairingly to be himself, or by remaining despairingly unconscious of having a self and an eternal self, has in reality will to tear his self away from the power which constituted it. This is sin, and its opposite is not virtue, but faith. By relating itself to its own self and by willing to be itself, the self is grounded transparently in the power which constituted it. The Christian heroism is to venture wholly to be oneself as an individual man. This definite individual man alone before the face of God, alone in this tremendous exertion and this tremendous responsibility. So Brettel captures a great deal of what Kierkegaard is going to write about here, about this unity as being what the church calls sin, and as being the only way to resolve this is to bring the self back together, back into the original relationship that man had before God, before Adam broke apart this relationship. And then he gives us different relationships that we can either be aware that we're a self or not be aware that we're a self, or aware that we're a self and not want to be one, and we'll cover some of these in more detail. With this background or summary of the sickness unto death, we can now begin to look more deeply into the responsibility or the consequences of being a self. So please keep in mind that we do have a limited time in order to go over a great amount of material. And so again, if we use this book, I will be using this book, a Kierkegaard anthology, as a guideline or as a teacher's tool. From this, I hope to give you the tools to apply for yourselves to this wonderful work, this wonderful book, to get all you can from it. So what I will be doing is revealing Kierkegaard's thinking by taking samples of his applications in hope that you can then apply what you learn here on your own. Despair is defined in the dictionary. It's always, I guess, a good thing to start out on the same page here. So if we went to the dictionary, some dictionary, whichever one you want to go to, despair is defined in some manner as being a person who's overwhelmed by futility or experiences a sense of defeat. It's also a sense of loss of hope. To have despair of the self is to have no hope in the self and being overwhelmed by a sense of being defeated. It is a horrible place to be. It's a place that, however, according to Kierkegaard, we all are here at one point or another. It's just that many don't realize it. Since for the Christian, death is not the last thing, but it is a transition into eternal life, then for the Christian who believes, there is no despair. But for the one who does not believe, the last thing to experience is death. This brings a sense of hopelessness and meaninglessness to his present reality. Now, Brettel brings up an excellent point in his book. He says that the sphere of which Kierkegaard is speaking is not death itself, but the life preceding the death is the sickness which is in despair, since there's nothing more to life than the experience of the now. In other words, for the unbeliever, there is no eternal life. There is no kingdom of heaven. It's just the here and the now, if one does not believe in God. And this hopelessness, in this case, is that death itself is not really a relief, since in death one does not experience any relief. So if there is no eternal life, then at the point of death, there's no longer any thinking, any feeling. So the despair that one has leads right up to death, is not resolved by death. In this manner, he means that if we consider that death is annihilation, one does not experience such, but only the meaninglessness of life that leads up to the moment of annihilation. And if there is an eternity, then one's death is an experience of nothingness forever. So for the unbeliever, if there is an eternity, then he will experience this eternal nothingness forever. The dreadfulness of the sickness is that one must live a life that brings him up to the moment of death, yet the sickness never passes beyond death. The only experience that one has is that of the sickness that leads up to death. The idea is that one cannot experience relief from this sickness. So the sickness will simply pass into eternity, or our sense of existence will simply fade away. Kierkegaard now gives us a couple examples of despair that are very helpful. he tells us that a man who desires or wishes to become Caesar, yet he fails to become Caesar, this man is in despair. So he wishes to become Caesar, and yet he fails to become Caesar. Therefore, he goes into a state of despair. He's in despair not simply because he failed to become Caesar, but because he is consuming himself with the despair of failure to become Caesar. So the despair is not necessarily in not becoming Caesar, but his despair is in the act of failure to become Caesar. This state is intolerable to him because he is not Caesar. The state is not altogether the failure, but the fact that he cannot be Caesar. His despair is that he cannot become another self, but must remain as he was. So this is a basic laying out of how despair comes about. He wants to be somebody else, and Kierkegaard picks Caesar here. He fails to become somebody else, this Caesar. It's not the fact that he can't become Caesar, but the fact that he can't become another self that's in play. Now, even if he did succeed at becoming Caesar, he would still be in despair, since he would not be Caesar in truth, but only as an escape from his self. He'd be running away from himself. In other words, being Caesar is nothing more than an escape from whom he really is. And if he should accomplish this escape, he really profits nothing. So we see here two despairs, one of failing to become another self, and the other of becoming another self. Both are running away from the truth, is, I think, one of the underlying points, running away from the true self. The other example is one of a lover who loses her love by either death or cheating. She does not fulfill her destiny by becoming his beloved. It's a woman in this example who wants to be in a relationship with her lover. Her lover means everything to her, but for one reason or another, she cannot be in this relationship. Maybe she's found out he cheated on her, or maybe he dies. But whatever the case, she despairs because she cannot become this other self, which is his beloved. Yet, even if she did succeed at becoming his lover, she would still be in despair because she would become another self, which is not her true self. She would be losing herself in her new self. So by becoming his lover, she gives up her true self. And if she fails to become his lover, she still fails because she struggles and still struggles trying to become a new self. Another case is a little more difficult to understand. It's a case where a man wants to be himself. And one might think that this is a way out of despair. All man needs to do is want to become oneself, and that's it. But Kierkegaard doesn't see it this way. Since the man wants to be himself and will not allow himself to be lost, the self which he wills to be is not a true self, since it is the one of his own creation. It is not the self that God intended him to be. For him to be this self under his own power, he would have to defy God's will to be a true self. So by man trying to become his own self, he becomes an imitation or a masquerade of himself. Even if he succeeded at becoming a new self, he would fail to become his true self, and he despairs. And if he remains his old self, he also despairs because he wants to become a new self and cannot. So a person who is a self, and he says, well, I want to become myself, isn't really attempting to become himself. He's struggling to become what he considers to be himself, which is usually a masquerade, an imitation of himself, and would be a failure in Kierkegaard's opinion. And we'll see this a little deeper in case you're either lost or you don't quite grasp the idea of failing to be oneself. So what then ought man to do to resolve this conflict within himself? He must stand before God as an individual in truth or transparency. Only now can man become transformed into the image that God wills him to be. So this is the point, that we need to become a self, but not the self that we want to become. We need to become the self that God wills us to become. Now, the idea of despair can be applied not only to the individual, but it could also be applied to the corporate sense, or even the church itself. So we must keep this in mind as we continue through Kierkegaard's work. This may not be apparent in Sickness Unto Death, but it's apparent in the present age and in Fear and Trembling. The idea of the corporate or the corporation, which can even be translated into the church. So the church can be in despair if it's considered to be a person, or the corporation could be in despair as it considers itself to be a person. We now enter into the section where Kierkegaard presents different forms of despair.